Happy Friday, it's Kate from Core Wellbeing, and I actually am going to tell you how eating gluten might be able to help you rob a bank, should that be something that you're interested in doing, which hopefully you're not. I attended a seminar earlier this week and I thought this was really quite amusing and interesting, and basically they referred to a study that was done quite a while ago. It was sometime in the 70s, I believe, where they actually assessed a number of people who had uncontrolled celiac disease, so who were celiacs and were still ingesting gluten. And they also assessed controls, so people who didn't have celiac disease and were also eating gluten. And what they found was that I believe it was around like 65 of the 75 people who were ingesting gluten who had celiac disease, they actually found changes to their fingerprints varying from just marginal changes to entire loss of their fingerprints, compared to the control group where they didn't observe any changes. So I just thought that was really quite interesting and funny, and not really funny actually if you're experiencing it, because what it would mean, basically our epithelial tissue, so our skin tissue, it's the same tissue that's inside the digestive tract. So that would be the explanation as to why eating gluten when you're a celiac and having those changes to the intestinal mucosa would actually end up being reflected on your skin. And so I really have been wanting to talk about gluten for a while, because this is something that I feel very, very passionately about, as with most things that I tend to video about. So I often get asked, like, what is the perfect diet? What diet should everyone be eating? And the answer for me is there is no one size fits all approach. But if there was to be one approach that I really encourage people to follow, it would definitely be a whole foods diet and a gluten-free diet. Now, that often comes up against so much resistance, and that's another aspect that I really want to talk about. I cannot understand where this attachment to gluten comes from. I feel as though if I was to say to people, oh, I want you to have a kale-free diet for the rest of your life, or I want you to have an orange-free diet for the rest of your life, people wouldn't have the same kind of repulsion with the suggestion. They wouldn't come up with so many other arguments or just so much resistance as to why, no, it's a bad idea because maybe then I'll develop a sensitivity, or we're about to have my cat in the picture. Sorry. There's just a lot of resistance. People really don't want to give it up. And I question, or I encourage you to question, why is that? Because what is it about gluten that's so damn special that you want to keep it in your diet at the detriment of your health? Now, I know that there's probably people who are going to suggest that gluten is fine for them, it doesn't cause any issues, and maybe that is the case. But today I want to detail just as many as I possibly can ways that you can actually be reacting to gluten, and why I feel that if we were to make a blanket rule and take it out from everyone's diet, then we would have a significantly healthier society on the whole. So I guess firstly, celiac disease. So that's the autoimmune type of gluten reactivity whereby ingesting gluten encourages your own immune system to start attacking your own tissue, so the cells, the lining of your intestines. Basically, throughout the intestines, we have these little finger-like projections called microvilli, and their job is to pull the nutrients from the intestines into the bloodstream so that we can absorb them, utilize them, etc. When people with celiac disease ingest gluten in any quantity, those microvilli over time get flattened. So this poses massive issues, particularly huge inflammatory issues, can be huge nutritional deficiencies, and then we see this widespread, array of symptoms all across the body. You can also have quite silent celiac disease, so I think a lot of people expect that if they're reacting to gluten, or if they're a celiac, that they'll ingest it and have this immediate, really kind of overt reaction, and it's actually not often the case. I've had a number of clients, there's one I'm thinking of in particular, who when you took her case history, she was seemingly a picture of health, didn't really have a whole lot going on at all except for fatigue that was quite debilitating, but no digestive issues whatsoever, no female repro issues whatsoever, no mood issues, no weight issues, everything else was seemingly fine. So we ended up doing a food sensitivity test, and from that, because of how high her reactivity to gluten was, we went further and we actually had the test for celiac disease. So there's actually a number of ways you can test it, which I'll also go into, and found that in fact she was a celiac. Now she was in her 40s. Who knows how long she'd been having issues for, but it certainly wasn't at the front of my mind, her mind. But it was very real. And as soon as she pulled out that gluten, she just noticed this huge improvement in her health when she didn't even realize there was a problem other than her energy to begin with. So you can have celiac disease and not necessarily be symptomatic, but underneath it's going to be causing issues. There is no way around that. There's no way, I mean, to my knowledge, never say never, but at this point in time, celiac disease is considered to be lifelong. So you do have to have strict avoidance of gluten for the rest of your life. Otherwise, you are causing irreparable damage to your intestines. In terms of testing for celiac disease, the gold standard is doing a biopsy. So when you have a colonoscopy, they take a sample of the tissue and they will assess it to see whether you have active celiac disease. Now, with the testing, I mean, a biopsy, and if you get it positive, then great. That is not great, but it is a confirmation that you have celiac disease. However, outside of that, a negative result doesn't necessarily mean that A, you don't have it, and B, you won't ever develop it. So generally in my clinic, I would want people to do a genetic test, so to see if they have the gene that is known to be I guess a driver behind celiac disease. The presence of the gene doesn't mean that you definitely have celiac disease at that point in time. However, it does mean that you have, I guess, the likelihood, you have that susceptibility to develop it down the track. And any trigger, it can be stress, it can be a virus, it can be time, it can be anything can trigger that to suddenly become an active disease. The absence of the gene pretty much guarantees that you won't ever develop celiac disease, but it doesn't mean that you won't have other reactivity to gluten. You can also test for certain antibodies in a blood test, and again that will give you an indication around active celiac disease, but it doesn't give you that potential for, maybe you could still develop it down the track. So there's a few ways that we can assess. In terms of do I feel that assessment is necessary? Sometimes my preference actually would be just for no one to eat gluten ever, because there's no benefit to ingesting it. So when we have this host of issues with it, why not just pull it out? So outside of celiac disease, you can then have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, this is mediated by two parts of the immune system. So you can have an IgA response or an IgG response. Now, they're just two different types of antibodies that the body basically creates when it has this sensitivity picture. And what we find there with gluten sensitivity is you can be also asymptomatic or have seemingly unrelated symptoms. It can affect anywhere in the body. So again, it can be digestive symptoms. It can also be a drain on your energy. It can be issues with fertility. That's a huge one. Also celiac disease. It can be skin issues. It can be mood issues. It can be sleep issues. It can be any issue in the body that you have. It could potentially be any food reactivity, but I would say gluten is one of the big ones that I see a lot. Again, in terms of assessing this, it's something that, yes, we can assess it in clinic. I would do a food sensitivity test that assesses both those parts of the immune system. And I'm going to record a video about that soon, because I really want to talk about the different types of testing and why it's very important to work with a lab that you know is thorough and can have reproducible results, because a lot of them can't. Again, confirmation, if you get a positive result, that's a pretty good confirmation. If you get a negative result, I wouldn't rule it out completely. And again, it's something that you could potentially develop down the track. When we're looking at gluten sensitivity in that sense, so the IgA and IgG mediated reaction, it's actually a lot to do with the gut membrane, so the permeability of that membrane throughout your digestive tract. Now, our whole digestive tract is only one cell thick, so it's not very, I'm I mean, it is strong. It is like, it's obviously sturdy, it does a really good job, but it's quite permeable and it's quite susceptible to damage, which leads me to the next way that we can react to gluten. So what they've found is that the ingestion of gluten activates an enzyme, or I guess a protein within the body called zonulin. Now, zonulin is a very effective thing to have when you're a baby, and basically what it does is it opens the junctions within that intestinal mucosa in order to, in a baby, allow immunoglobulins into the blood, so you can basically set up your immune system. So this is something that happens through breast milk, and it's how babies basically, I guess, harness that immune response through what their mother's been exposed to, and in that time it serves a purpose. So sorry, I've got so much to say, I'm probably jumping around a little bit. The intestinal mucosa is permeable. It has little holes in it so that vitamins, minerals, like things that should be in the blood supply can get in there, but things that are too large and haven't been digested effectively don't get out. And over time, and this can be due to stress, medication, oral contraceptive pill, food intolerances, a whole host of reasons, that membrane becomes more permeable. So basically those junctions get wider, and as a result, you end up leaching undigested proteins as well as other things such as bacteria or things that just shouldn't be in the blood supply can get out. And that's when you tend to set up that immune response, so that IgA, IgG mediated reaction that I mentioned. When you're ingesting gluten, it activates that enzyme zonulin, which is one of the things that can cause that hyperpermeability. So as I mentioned, in babies, that's good. We want that to happen. In adults, we don't necessarily want that to happen, because we want it to have like little small holes so that things that need to get out can, but keeps all that other stuff inside. What they found, and I'm not clear around the specific genes, but there are genetic markers that would determine whether or not your exposure to gluten activates zonulin for a short period of time. So I believe it's like less than 1 hour, it might be less than 30 minutes, where it would open and close up again. But in other people, that zonulin activation can last for more like 5 to 6 hours. So if you then think about a day, a typical Western diet, and what people might be eating. Let's say breakfast, they have a bowl of cereal, and then lunch, they have a wrap, and then dinner, they come home and they have pasta. So you've then, and or even let's say they don't have a bowl of pasta, let's say you make a stir fry and use some sort of sauce. Oftentimes, they will have a lot of gluten in them. Gluten is sneaky, and in manufactured foods, things that are processed, you will often find it even when you don't expect it to be there. So you could very easily, without necessarily having a very unhealthy, like junk food diet, be exposing yourself to gluten breakfast, lunch, dinner, and probably like snacks in between as well. So if you're the person who has the genetic predisposition to responding to zonulin for 5 to 6 hours, that membrane's then permeable for the whole day. That's when people talk about leaky gut, which I guess is just a very colloquial term for that hyperpermeability. Having that picture creates, again, whole host of issues. So predisposes you to food intolerances, which can set up other issues within the body. But even aside from that, you have impaired nutrient absorption, you will have high levels of inflammation, and it can stem to any system in the body. So then, inflammation, for example, they're looking at it. I mean, we know it's a driver behind most chronic conditions, but specifically things like depression, they're viewing as inflammation of the brain, which very much clinically speaking, I am seeing for sure. Inflammatory bowel issues, inflammatory skin conditions, just generalized inflammation. It means that your body is having to deal with it's not the state that we're naturally supposed to be in. We shouldn't be walking around with this tap of inflammatory markers dripping all the time, and then your body has to basically clear it out and respond accordingly, but it's quite a misguided reaction, if that makes sense. So that's zonulin. We then can have like a true allergy, so a wheat allergy, for example, where generally people will know you'll ingest the food and you'll have that immediate hypersensitivity. So from immediate ingestion or up to about 4 hours after you've ingested the food, you'll have some sort of quite overt reaction. So it can be hives, it can be, worst case anaphylaxis, like throat closing over. Generally, those people know, and I wouldn't need to go down the path of testing. As you can see, there are many, many, many ways that we can react to gluten. I probably haven't even covered all of it. Gluten, aside from all of that, is just inherently difficult to digest. And specifically, the gluten that we have here in Australia, because of our agricultural processes. The way that we've farmed gluten over time, we've basically hybridized, particularly wheat. We've hybridized it so that it is a very sturdy plant. It can withstand our climate. We can grow a large amount of it all year round, which from a food manufacturing point of view is great because they have this supply of wheat, gluten. But for us, it's not so great. That grain doesn't get any, less sturdy once we ingest it. So the body then has this huge job to metabolize this gluten protein. And it creates, again, that inflammation, that irritation, the nutrient deficiencies. It's putting an increased load on our digestive system, which already is so loaded up with all of the stuff that we're exposed to. Gluten just isn't my friend, and I really don't feel like it's your friend. Some people will say like they've cut it out and they didn't really notice a difference. Unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe, you do have to cut it out for a really extended period of time. So absolute minimum of 4 weeks, which would allow any antibody reactions to clear from the system. But I would go as far as to say even like 3 to 6 months, and then just like keep on going forever and don't ever bring it back in. But basically, you have to be strict, because if you are having a reaction to gluten, your body's like sitting up here in terms of what it's experiencing, and you need to have time to clear that from the system and bring yourself back down to a baseline. But if you're going to go half-hard and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of like mostly avoided it, then you'd always be topping up whatever reaction you're having. So it's not ever going to give you a clear indication. People always ask me, if they remove gluten, are they going to develop a reaction to it? And the answer is no. That's not how the immune system works. If you have a true allergy or you have celiac disease, that is deemed to be lifelong. So you don't want to be having it anyway, but even if you took it out and put it back in, it's not going to change the original condition that you had. With the food sensitivity, so that IgA mediated response, what we see there is you actually have a cumulative effect. So the absence of gluten means that you won't have any antibodies there. So when you reintroduce it, you can't possibly be having a more overt reaction than what you were originally. What I find, however, is that people tend to be, if they are reacting and they've been eating it for a long time, they kind of just have this generalized symptoms. And when you pull it out and you're peeling back the layers, obviously we don't just pull out gluten. I'd always be addressing what other health symptoms are going on. When you reintroduce it, you've kind of got this clean slate, so you can see a lot more clearly what the reaction was. It's not that it actually is stronger, it's just that it's more evident because you've kind of peeled back everything else. What other questions do I get asked? They're probably the really main ones. People talk about how avoiding gluten is so hard. People get really concerned about judgment from their friends or their family or from the waiter in the restaurant. And that's something that we really need to let go of, because if you're eating something that is not good for your health, just don't eat it. It doesn't make sense. Why would I make myself sick because I'm worried that the guy at the cafe is going to judge me for asking for a gluten-free option? I care way more about my health than what their opinion is. Actually, it frustrates me that people feel it's necessary to justify, like, oh, I'm an actual celiac, not like a kind of pretend gluten-free person, because in terms of symptoms and how it can affect your health, they can be equally bad. As I mentioned, some people with celiac disease may not feel anything, whereas some people with gluten sensitivity may have like totally debilitating diarrhea or bloating or eczema, or like there's so many different ways that you can be experiencing it, and neither one is better or worse. It's all impacting your health in different ways. The fertility side of things is really interesting, and anyone experiencing infertility, I would say both partners should be off gluten entirely. There is a lot of research going into this area, and unfortunately, when women and men are experiencing infertility, there's so many other avenues that are often explored, particularly by, I guess, more mainstream fertility specialists, that celiac disease and gluten sensitivity can be often overlooked. But in terms of how it affects the body, again, that level of inflammation is not conducive with falling pregnant. Nutrient deficiency is not conducive with falling pregnant. Autoimmunity makes it certainly more challenging because your immune response is misguided and you're attacking your own tissue. So if you're trying to then implant a baby, there's always the risk that your body's going to recognize that and attack that too. So yeah, so much to add to this. I probably will do about 500,000 other videos on gluten, but I really wanted to get this out there as a starting place. Maybe I'll film another one soon about what is gluten found in, other options, alternatives, that kind of thing. So if you do have any questions and something that you want me to speak about specifically, then please send it my way. In the meantime, let's all retain our fingerprints, shall we? And give gluten a miss. Have a great weekend, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.